This being my senior year and my last debate round of my last tournament, I hope it'll be an interesting round, to say the least. So with that being said, I'm going to jump into the points and show that Arcane is indeed meeting all the stock issues and that there are some very, very serious harms in the status quo which need to be fixed. So that being said, I'm going to jump out of order a little bit, but I'll be more or less, I'll make sure I hit all the points. Starting with the status quo advantage of the negative team. They mentioned that in the status quo, that we need to have a level playing field, and that is in the status quo, and that we need to maintain that. And they said that we're going to be losing that because we'll no longer be able to put tariffs on foreign countries to sort of punish them and to make things equal. And their evidence mainly talks about the fact that we need to make sure other countries will be playing by the rules. However, we still have sanctions in the status quo. Our mandates merely deal with tariffs and are mainly and only removing tariffs. And so sanctions will still be available, which means we can ban products from being traded with us, which is punishment enough to keep other people and other nations on their toes and playing by the rules. So that's not really an issue, and it still applies to our plan. Moving on to the disadvantage that they brought up under our mandates, I believe is where they sort of brought that up, which was loss of revenue. This loss of revenue is a very insignificant number. It's only 1% of the federal revenue, so that's not an issue which really needs to be worried about too much in the status, since in this case, because of our advantages, the economic benefits that we're going to be gaining are much more substantial than this, and the revenue that we lose will most likely be made up in the growth of the economy that we will see through our plan. With that being said, let's move on to Mandate 2, where they mentioned extra topicality. This isn't really an issue because we are not claiming any advantages from it, and extra topicality is only an issue if you're claiming advantages from the mandate. The mandate says we're removing tariffs on all nations, but we only claim advantages from Mandate 1, which removes it on China. So we can see that there's no issue. And they can ask me about our evidence. With all of our evidence, we are directly applying it to China. Moving on to Advantage 1. Under Advantage 1, they talked about the fact that this advantage is already happening, and they said that this outsourcing is actually leading to loss of jobs, not the increase in jobs and increase in technology, which the affirmative team claimed. However, they didn't mention anything about the technology, actually. They just mentioned the fact about jobs. So we assume that there will indeed be an increase in technology if we do indeed increase the amount of this beneficial outsourcing, which is in the status quo in which we intend to benefit. And so the reason that this is happening is that is because when businesses extend themselves to places like China, the businesses over there need to be able to function, and they need as much help as they can get. And so since they're small and they're in a country which is somewhat hostile to American businesses, they like to pirate our stuff, they need to be able to send their stuff back to their American counterparts, you could say, their American base, and in order to, otherwise they won't be able to function very well out there, and it's not worth the cost. But by removing tariffs, there will now be a much lower cost to this sending resources back to America, which is where a lot of their resources are going to end up getting sent. And so by doing this, the business will be able to function, and businesses will be easier for them to go and claim the benefits, which my partner talked about in his example of Procter & Gamble. Moving on to Advantage 3. Advantage 3 talks about, actually I have to take that back, they mentioned something at the end about competition. They said this was under Advantage 1 as well. We claimed an increase in competition because we're going to be increasing technology. The evidence we read said that when we lose jobs due to loss of competition, in the end what we end up with is more high-tech jobs, and technology is the fuel of competition, as my partner read evidence for. So that's what the whole competition thing was, and we are indeed going to be increasing it. Moving on to Advantage 3. Advantage 3 talks about human rights, and the main arguments that my partner brought up was that these human right benefits are not going to be immediate, that loss of jobs is the same thing as loss of human rights. However, I'd like you to disregard that aspect of it because we'll just address that sort of in the economy sector. And then talking about, they said that freedom of Chinese hurts the U.S. First of all, freedom of Chinese is something very important. They are people just as important as U.S. people. And so we shouldn't think that their human rights are insignificant or worthless, and we should indeed be working to help them out if we can do it without a significant cost to ourselves. So the other thing that they said is that these effects are not going to be immediate. Whether they're immediate or, let's see, they didn't argue this, however. These effects will indeed be immediate because, well, our trade will spike instantly. The Chinese will see these tariffs disappear, so they'll start shipping more goods here, which means an increase in trade, which means our evidence applies to that. They said there's a long train of thought, but they didn't argue any single point of it. That basically means that they dropped the point. That means that our logic applies since they didn't hack any part of it apart, which means that when we increase trade, that means we will increase interaction, which means we will increase the exchange of values as our evidence read. And which means through that exchange of values, they'll see the freedom that we have in America, they'll want it for themselves, and the Chinese will start to reform their own government and increase their human rights. Moving on to Harm 2 and Advantage 4. Harm 2 talks about a potential trade war. What my partner was saying in his speech, and we have some evidence saying that from the Miami Herald that the House voted a bill 376 to 76, I believe, something in that number, to pass a bill which increases currency, puts tariffs on the Chinese because they manipulate their currency. And the Chinese said that when this bill is passed, this will initiate a trade war. The Chinese themselves have said it. So we have to assume, looking at the vote, 348 it was to 76, I think is actually what the vote was. We see that the Senate and the House are intent on passing this bill, and so we have to assume the worst, and we have to assume there's a huge risk that this bill will be passed, and that thus we will be seeing a trade war happen immediately, which the negative team agreed was a very bad thing. They just said it was insignificant compared to other things that was going on. So we can see that we are indeed stopping that, since we're preventing any tariffs from being put on, which is what this bill tries to do. Alright, that leaves me with harm 1 and advantage 2. I'd like to bring up a piece of evidence, first of all, that shows that tariffs are indeed a very bad thing and that we need to get rid of all of them because there are very, very few tariffs which have any beneficial effect. From Douglas A. Irwin, who's a professor of economics at Dartmouth College in 2009, tells us, trade barriers are like an income transfer in which $10 is taken from consumers while giving only $8 to producers, resulting in a $2 loss to the economy as a whole. That's something my partner read. Now, moving on to another piece of evidence, talking about the steel tariff. My partner already talked about the sugar tariff, showing that it was much more negative than it was beneficial. From the Cato Institute by Daniel J. Ickes on October 11, 2010. In the steel tariff example, the institution might publish results that indeed show a $100 million benefit for steel producers, but also a $300 million overall cost to the economy. What this means is that the steel tariff had far more negative effects than beneficial effects, so by removing it, we will be benefiting the economy. However, there's one other aspect of harm 1 which I'd like to address, and this is the fact that there is a huge, huge disaster looming in the status quo, and it needs to be removed and stopped immediately. So let's look at this. Tariffs have a very negative side effect because they increase the cost of products, which means that businesses are now going to be suffering because they have to pay for these extra products to make their products. So this means that we're going to see a loss of jobs because they're no longer going to be able to hire as many people. Loss of jobs means less people are paying the income tax, which means the government's going to be losing revenue. As we all know, the government already has very low revenue and they can't afford to lose any more. So as this harm increases, as these tariffs continue to exist, we'll see a continued loss of government revenue until they can't stand it anymore, and we're going to see them reach the breaking point. When this happens, the government's going to be forced to cut our welfare programs. There's going to be no choice but to do that since that's one of our biggest programs that we have. So when you cut welfare, we have thousands and thousands of American poor on welfare. What are they going to do when this happens? They're not going to stand for it. They're not going to stand for government taking away all this money that they've had for so many years. So what does this mean? A revolt of the American poor. When the poor revolt, what we're going to see is the U.S. government collapse. They're going to come in, they're going to take over the U.S. government and toss it out the window. What this means is that the American economy is going to end up collapsing. With the American economy collapse, the Chinese are going to take advantage of this, and they're going to try and do what the Soviet Union tried to do. And they're going to try and attempt communist world domination. Now, what this means is that the remaining U.S. population are not going to stand for this. They will not stand for the communists conquering them because they will not be able to use the chopsticks that the Chinese are going to enforce on them. So, what does this mean? Since they're not going to stand for it, a crazy U.S. revolutionary is bound to come up, and there's going to have no choice, but they're going to have to go to the Italian mafia. I'd like to read a piece of evidence according to Jacob S. Miller, who's a novice debater, happens to be my brother, a supposed mafia member. He said, the Italian mafia are willing to supply the U.S. nuclear weapons if a revolution against Chinese were to arise. So our U.S. revolutionaries are going to go and obtain nuclear weapons from the Chinese mafia, and they're going to end up giving it out to hippies, because we obviously have to give them. So they're probably the best people that we have. So when the hippies get these nuclear weapons, we're going to have no choice, and it's going to be inevitable that a nuclear war is going to come about. And with this nuclear war, we're going to see in December 2012 the last survivors of the human race dying of nuclear radiation.